Our next speaker is Erin Berman. Erin is an ORISE Fellow at the US EPA ORD Lab in Narragansett, Rhode Island. Erin studies the social and economic implications of the changing coastal wetlands in New England. Over to Erin.
Erin, you're muted.
Thank you so much, Kathy.
You're welcome.
All right. Hope everyone can see my screen.
Yes.
Great. All right. So hello all. My name is Erin Berman, and I will be presenting today on hazardous and contaminated sites within salt marsh migration corridors in Rhode Island. And I wanted to shout out to my wonderful collaborators, Kathy Weigand, Kate Mulvaney, who we just heard from, Nate Merrill, all of these folks at EPA, and then Michael Bradley at the University of Rhode Island. So today in this workshop, we've established that coastal salt marshes are valuable to ecosystems and people, and we've also established that they're vulnerable and can use management and protection. And this is just as true in Rhode Island as elsewhere. And one management consideration that I'm going to focus on is that as sea levels rise, marshes are going to undergo changes. And one of those changes might be marsh migration. So marshes migrate upland when sea level rise effectively drowns the lowest lying marsh, but then also inundates previously dry uplands, replacing whatever dryland ecosystem was there with new marsh. And the upland does need to be permeable for marsh to migrate onto it, so paved roads and buildings are going to be a barrier. And so in this diagram, you can see how migration works. Migration is causing marsh loss closest to the water, but then potentially marsh gain upland. And then in the middle, there's some persistent marsh that remains. Here is a diagram of what marsh migration might look like on a map. So this is a lagoon or salt pond behind barrier beaches in Rhode Island. And here marsh migration by the year 2050 has been modeled, assuming 86 centimeters of sea level rise by that time, which is one reference scenario used by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. And so in yellow, we see current marsh that would drown under this scenario. And in blue, we see new marsh that might grow. And in green, of which there's little on the far left, and right of this map, we see persistent marsh that exists now and is also projected to exist under the sea level rise scenario. And I'll note that this model is not taking into account any impermeable surface or development that might impede migration. And indeed, there are many possible barriers to marsh migration. And among the more concerning are hazardous and contaminated sites. I define this pretty broadly as facilities, infrastructure, and other sites that store, use, or release toxic substances. And understanding their presence within marsh migration corridors can help inform the practices of environmental remediation and marsh conservation and restoration. And here's an example in the Providence area, and this is kind of by the East Bay Bike Path, of where some marsh is in the vicinity of heavy industry. So my question in this project was, what are the types and distribution of hazardous and contaminated sites that may encounter migrating marsh in Rhode Island? And we see in this illustration that there may be many kinds of hazardous sites, from industrial facilities to storage tanks to other biohazards. And this question is part of, again, this larger research plan about the social and economic considerations around marsh change in Rhode Island. So in explaining how I went around about this, I'd like to start by profiling our study site, Rhode Island. Despite our small size, we are known as the ocean state due to our extensive coastline. Rhode Island is home to the Narragansett Bay, as well as several coastal lagoons or salt ponds, which are estuarine ecosystems that are tidally connected to the ocean but protected from small waves. And between the bay and these ponds, there is a fair amount of protected shoreline that is good for marsh. So the state has around 4,000 acres of marsh, or about the size of 4.5 central parks. And it's really important to preserve what we have. So the area of marsh is less than half of what existed prior to European contact with the area. And this is because Rhode Island is quite densely populated and developed, and relevant to hazardous and contaminated sites, it is also considered one of the birthplaces of the American Industrial Revolution. So there have been facilities and other sites with potential for contamination in Rhode Island for quite a while. So here's a map of the current extent of marsh in Rhode Island. You can see a lot of marsh along the southern coast in these lagoons, and also further up the Narragansett Bay on the right. It's a little hard to see the marsh in a state map, so I've added some insets showing marsh in 3 different areas. So Circle A is around kind of downtown Providence, at the top of the bay, and you can see that a little marsh does manage to grow there in the city, as I showed you in a picture a few slides ago. Circle B is around the city of Barrington, which is on the Narragansett Bay too, and is a little more suburban. And Circle C is around a salt pond lagoon along the southern coast in the rural community of Galilee. And as you can see, salt ponds can support pretty large marsh areas. So for this project, we weren't just concerned with current marsh, of course, we were also interested in future migrating marsh. So to predict where marsh might go, we used this model that's sort of come up a few times today called SLAM, Sea Level Affecting Marsh Model. And for this model, you input a current map of salt marsh, a sea level rise scenario, elevation data, soil accretion rates, tide data, and other similar inputs. And you get as an output a map of marsh migration under that scenario. So here's the model represented in 2 and 3 dimensions. And you can see here how elevation, among other parameters, affects where open water, wetlands, and drylands will go. And so that map I showed earlier was actually a SLAM scenario. So here we have the current marsh, the migration projection by 2050, assuming 86 centimeters of sea level rise, and the persistent places where they overlap. And finally, in order to identify hazardous and contaminated sites, I had several sources, including the EPA's Facility Registry Service, a similar state database by the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management, called the Plover Dataset, permits, licenses, and other vital environmental records. I got stormwater outfall information from another Rhode Island source, and then finally, I acquired EPA Superfund polygons from another source, and I wanted these to be polygons instead of points as the other data was, because Superfund sites can often be have a significant area to them. And we were able to approximate the hazards posed by the sites using the SCORE framework, which stands for Sediment-Bound Contaminant Resiliency and Response, which was created by the USGS a few years ago. And they offer a kind of a framework that ranks facility registry service sites based on the hazard they might pose to human and aquatic life if they are breached and their contaminants enter water bodies. And so the ranks can be between 1 to 4, with 1 representing a little or no hazard risk to human and aquatic life, all the way to 4, which indicates that that facility might have hazardous effects on human and aquatic life if it were breached. And then so finally, using GIS, I took a SLAM model assuming 268 centimeters of sea level rise by 2100, which is just under 9 feet, which is a fairly extreme NOAA scenario. And I overlaid it with the hazardous site points that I collected from the EPA, the Rhode Island databases, and other sources. And again, we used a SLAM model that disregarded impervious surface or protected shorelines and just allowed marsh to migrate onto these features anyway, because we wanted to capture the full range of migratory possibilities. And then I also added a 200-foot buffer, equaling 61 meters, as I will refer to it later, around the migration scenario. And that reflects the Rhode Island Coastal Resource Management Center, or Council, their jurisdiction around marshes. And the CRMC is a state regulatory agency in Rhode Island with jurisdiction around coastal features, including marshes. And I added this buffer so that I can hopefully capture any marsh adjacent sites that I might miss by sticking more strictly to a SLAM boundary, or that might become inundated as marsh migration continues after 2100. So here's what we found. Our work showed that hazardous and contaminated sites are widespread within marsh migration corridors. We found just 25 sites within current marsh, but over 40 times that many sites in areas within projected marsh migration corridors by 2100. And then within that 61-meter buffer around the migration corridors, there were almost 1,000 more hazardous and contaminated sites. And so here's a map of the state with the hazardous site locations in current or projected marsh, as well as within the 200-foot buffer. And I'll note that each point is a kind of a translucent orange, so any solid and bright orange you're seeing means that there is a density of sites in that area. And note, of course, that I'm also only showing sites near marsh corridors here, so there are certainly more hazardous sites further inland. And so you can see a little better, here are those 3 areas of Rhode Island again. So in urban Providence, marsh corridors contain many potentially hazardous sites, which you might expect given greater urbanization. And then in suburban Barrington, the density is a little bit less. And then in rural Galilee, by the salt ponds, there are even fewer sites. And we wanted to know what kinds of sites were these. And so we found that it really varied. So I'm gonna share with you the top 5 most frequent kind of sites that were within these corridors. And the most frequent site type was sites regulated by the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA, which is a federal law that authorizes the EPA to regulate facilities that handle hazardous wastes. And it's often said that this law enables cradle-to-grave tracking throughout a waste's life cycle. So these hazardous waste handlers could be generators, transporters, treaters, storers, or disposers of hazardous waste. And so this really encompasses kind of a pretty big variety of sites, from large industrial sites like factories or oil terminals, but also includes sort of smaller sites like small businesses and other facilities that happen to handle hazardous substances like dry cleaners, salons, and even schools. The second most common kind of site was stormwater outfalls. And these are just pipes that release stormwater into water bodies. So when you see storm drains on the side of the road, any stormwater going through these is probably coming out of a stormwater outfall in a body of water somewhere. And stormwater can have various pollutants in it, such as gasoline, heavy metals, nutrients, and sewage. Third, we had facilities regulated by the EPA's National Pollutant Discharge System, or NPDES, which registers point sources of pollution into waterways, whether that's directly or through a storm drain or some other way, and monitors these discharges to ensure that they do not hurt water quality or people's health. And this can also be a real variety of large industrial facilities, to farms, to smaller spots. The fourth most common kind of site was closed underground storage tanks. And underground storage tanks are simply tanks that contain hazardous substances like gasoline. So gas stations are a common example of this kind of site. And closed tanks are those that have been emptied and no longer in use, and so those are kept in a separate database. And then number 5 was underground storage tanks that are still active. And the concern with underground storage tanks is that they may corrode or otherwise become compromised, and then their contents could leak into the water, potentially groundwater. I'll go through this one a little bit faster. So here's a breakdown of site types in different areas. So on the far left, we have the 25 sites in current marsh, and that's really a different breakdown than the variety of sites in future marsh, which is, first of all, a great deal more sites, but also a greater variety. And then the last bar on the right is just all sites anywhere in Rhode Island, including inland ones. And so you see, again, there's a great number of RCRA sites versus in current marsh, where there's a great deal of stormwater outfalls. And 2 things I wanted to note about this chart is that some sites are counted more than once under several programs or data sets. And I'd also like to acknowledge that not all sites present the same dangers. And so when we look at score rankings in different areas, there are certainly differences, but not big ones on average. So average scores in current marsh were the highest at 3.08, and sites within that 61 meter buffer had the lowest average score at 2.98. So those are really similar. So consequences of marsh and hazardous and contaminated site overlap. We do know that stormwater outfalls in or near marsh may cause eutrophication, lowered salinity, changes in plant composition, and spread of invasive species like this Phragmites we can see on this marsh. We can also guess that maybe heavily polluted marshes may be unlikely to be candidates for restoration because contaminated sediment could be resuspended. On the other hand, restoring urban marsh has benefits because of the higher number of recreational use beneficiaries, and restoration could address historic environmental injustices. So these findings suggest opportunity for collaboration between marsh conservationists and coastal resiliency planners because often their areas of interest overlap, as we're seeing, and may overlap more in the future. We find that regional coastal resiliency planning considers marsh migration often, but often does not include much about hazardous and contaminated sites. So that could be in addition to the thinking about resiliency that states and municipalities are doing. And finally, we find that better publicizing inventories like FRS, Facility Registry Service, and ensuring that they're easily used, which I found was not always the case, can benefit stakeholders who are looking into overlap like this. Next steps of this research could include identifying priority marshes for conservation and restoration based on this overlap, expanding research outside of Rhode Island. We know that Rhode Island is not unique in its overlap between marsh and industry, and so exploring outside of the state could be useful. And finally, it would be beneficial to further characterize the hazards posed by hazardous and contaminated sites if inundated by marsh, because in many cases this is not known.
Thanks, Erin.
So thank you very much. And I look forward to any questions and comments that you may have.
Terrific. Now sometime, Erin, to receive questions. You and Kate will receive questions and Joe will facilitate that.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much, Erin, for that, for highlighting the relationship between marsh migration and contaminated sites, something I wasn't thinking about too much. And also Kate for bringing to life some actual projects involving multiple kinds of stakeholders. So let's take a look at, see what questions we have in the chat. And already, if they're in there, great, but please feel free to add additional ones. We have a few minutes for Q&A. Joan, anything?
Yeah, there were various questions and comments that came up. A few referred back to Kate's presentation, and Edward asked, did the Coir rolls work at Oak Bluffs? I would expect significant delay and loss of Coir.
That is excellent anticipation on your part. So the Coir logs are designed with a kind of a life expectancy for 5 years. Especially because it was on an Audubon property, it was all biodegradable materials to be included. That 5-year life is the idea of getting them in there so that kind of there can be accretion and getting the kind of shoreline in place before it degrades in that 5-year framework. 2 of them did not survive. We had 2 northeastern facing that got walloped in a nor'easter, and so those didn't make it and they had to be replaced. And so like expecting that it's not the strongest surface, it's kind of intentionally not in order to keep that kind of biodegradable material included. But it also does it brings in different types of challenges and new challenges to the project for sure.
Okay, thank you. Marilyn asked, was local government involved as a stakeholder and or regulator?
Okay, I'm guessing time-wise that would have been about the Senja-Kentucket project. So yeah, and the answer would be yes for both, I guess. Anyway, the Senja-Kentucket project, the town of in Massachusetts, each town has a shellfish constable, and they have a shellfish department. And so it was the shellfish department that approached EPA about having this be a research project. So they were kind of a key partner and in it from the beginning. Just because one part of the town was involved didn't mean that it didn't have to go through permitting through all the other parts of the town, and also with the state. And so they really were able to navigate that. And so maybe so some of the other departments were kind of seen as key stakeholders. So we're kind of kept apprised of what was ongoing and what was needed, and kind of results of the work as well.
Okay, thank you. Tammy asked a question, a specific question about the Ninigret Pond project that Caitlin indicated that more details will be discussed tomorrow, so we won't get into that. Kevin had commented that one thing that we found that really bonded our volunteers was celebrating the restoration completion success. We would have a gathering with food and refreshments, and that really created a family of volunteers that turned up over and over for multiple projects.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's very true, right? So, and that's somewhat consistent across different types of restoration projects, is that making people just feel like they contributed, and that there's this increased sense, they call it ownership, right? That they see it as theirs. My dad has volunteered here in Rhode Island a couple of times planting, marsh grass, and he thinks of them as his projects. And I know the other people who spend, their careers on it, and my dad is like, nope, that's mine because I planted the grass there. So really being able, and I think, restoration is hard, right? We do a lot of things that require flexibility and adaptation because, sometimes we, need to kind of continually adapt. And so celebrating success and appreciating the time that people have given us, I think is really undervalued. So thank you for pointing that out, Kevin.
Joan, we just have time for about one more question.
Yeah, that's what I was going to check. So one is a question to Erin. Aren't score values based on distance to contamination source? How did you rank them from 1 to 4 based on type of potential contaminant type or the distance to the source?
Yeah, so the paper that I was basing my score methodology off of did not use distance. It relied on several attributes directly from Facility Registry Service. So it was a facility type, interest type, and site type possibly. And each of those were ranked by an independent panel of experts for each of those attributes. And then in order to assign a ranking to a specific site, you choose the highest number from all those attributes. I'm glad to find that publication and drop it in the chat if you're interested.
That would be great. Please do that. And thank you so much, Erin and Kate and Joan. And now we're going to turn it back to Kathy.